There's a quiet illusion that wraps itself around modern life. It doesn't shout, it whispers, it doesn't confront, it comforts, and most people never question it because it feels like peace. But underneath that peace is something else entirely, a refusal to face what is, a refusal to see life as it actually is, flawed, painful, uncertain, and breathtaking, because real life is heavy, and fantasy is light. We often imagine fantasy as dragons and castles, fiction and escape, but the most dangerous fantasies are not the ones we read in novels. They are the ones we live in silence. They look like hope. They sound like confidence. They wear the mask of growth, love, purpose, and positivity. But deep down, they are defense mechanisms, clever, beautiful distractions we build around the parts of ourselves we cannot bear to face. Carl Jung once wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." That sentence wasn't poetry, it was prophecy, and you might be living it without even knowing. We all construct internal realities, stories we tell ourselves to survive. Some of them protect us, some inspire us, but some stories become prisons. Stories like, "I'm fine, I just need to manifest it. Once I find the right person, everything will fall into place. It's all part of the plan. I know myself. This time will be different." The truth is, most of these stories are written not by clarity, but by fear. We don't want to admit how much we don't know. We don't want to admit how lonely we really feel. We don't want to admit how lost we are. Without the labels, the goals, the relationships, the dreams we were taught to chase. And so we invent a fantasy, a beautifully edited version of reality, something that feels manageable, safe, certain. But fantasy has a cost. It delays growth, it silences pain, it separates us from the truth, and most tragically, it keeps us from becoming who we actually are. This video is not about judging others, it's about recognizing ourselves, because we all live in fantasy at some point. We all lie to ourselves in small, gentle ways. We all crave comfort more than confrontation. We all want to believe that life will deliver us the truth without requiring us to face it. But life doesn't work like that. At some point, something breaks. The fantasy crumbles, the mask slips, and what's left is the real work. That moment, painful as it may be, is sacred, because it's the first step toward something deeper than fantasy, awakening. In the next 5 parts, we will explore 5 types of people who are, often without realizing it, living in psychological fantasy. Not because they're bad, not because they're stupid, but because life hurt them and fantasy was safer than honesty. Each type will reflect a different strategy of avoidance. One hides behind love, another behind control, one behind positivity, another behind wisdom, one behind suffering. You may recognize someone you know, but more importantly, you may recognize yourself. That's not a reason for shame, it's a reason for compassion. Because awakening isn't about blaming, it's about finally seeing. So before we begin, take a breath. This is not a video to be consumed, it's a mirror to be looked into. And sometimes mirrors show things we've avoided for years. But the truth, when looked at fully, doesn't destroy us. It frees us. Let's begin. They always seem like they're waiting for someone, not for a ride, not for a meeting, but for something larger, someone larger, a soulmate, a twin flame, a cosmic match, a person who will arrive and make the scattered pieces of their life finally make sense. To the romantic escapist, love is not just a connection, it is salvation. You'll recognize them by how they talk about love. It's grand, intense, poetic, fated. They speak of emotional explosions, destiny, karmic timing, and how everything happens for a reason. They are deeply sensitive, deeply imaginative, and often deeply wounded, because for them, love is the ultimate fantasy. It's the place where pain becomes beautiful and longing becomes noble. They don't just want connection. They want transcendence. They want to be seen so perfectly, so fully, that all their shame disappears in the eyes of the other. But here's the quiet truth. They're not really searching for a person. They're searching for themselves, reflected in someone else. That's the trap. They've never been shown how to turn inward, so they turn all their longing outward onto an imagined other who will carry the weight they were never taught to hold. This fantasy can last for years, sometimes forever, because even when love appears, it's not enough. Real people disappoint. Real love is flawed. Real intimacy is slow, boring, uncomfortable. So they leave, or they suffer, or they idealize, and in doing so, they stay loyal to the fantasy, not to the person. But it can't let go, because it doesn't trust what will happen if it does. So instead, it builds systems, boundaries, routines, and it hides behind a smile that says, "I'm fine, I've got this." Even when, on the inside, you're screaming for someone else to take over, even just for a moment. But no one ever has. So this part of you doesn't believe anyone ever will. That's the tragedy. The fantasy of control isn't about power over others. It's about preventing pain. Pain you didn't ask for. Pain you didn't deserve. Pain that no one helped you carry. And if you could just stay ahead of it this time, maybe you wouldn't have to feel it again. But control doesn't protect you from pain. It just delays it and isolates you from the people who might help you carry it. Carl Jung wrote, "Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling, but in this shadow, thinking dominates. Feeling is locked away because it's messy, unreliable, dangerous. So this part of you doesn't cry. It calculates. It doesn't reach out. It fixes. It doesn't soften. It plans. But no amount of structure can substitute for connection, and no amount of order can make you feel safe if you don't feel seen. So what does healing look like for the one who controls? It starts slowly, gently, with this question: what am I afraid will happen if I stop holding everything so tightly? It continues with small surrenders, letting someone else make the plan, saying I don't know, sitting in silence without solving it, letting your hands unclench, letting your breath deepen, and eventually it becomes trust. Not blind trust, but earned trust in yourself, in others, in life. You don't have to be the one who keeps the world from falling apart. You don't have to be the emergency responder in every emotional fire. You are allowed to collapse sometimes. You are allowed to say, "This is too much." You are allowed to be held, because control is not the same as love, and strength is not the same as silence. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be weak and find out you're still safe. This part of you isn't the enemy. It's the protector, the survivor, the part that stepped in when no one else did. And now, maybe, just maybe, it can rest. Even for a moment, they're always kind, always thoughtful, always ready to help, support, say the right thing, do the right thing. They never raise their voice. They rarely say no. They're always there for others, no matter what, and everyone loves them, except maybe themselves. This is the second face of the shadow, the one who pleases, not out of love, not out of peace, but out of fear, fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being too much or not enough. So instead of showing up as themselves, they show up as who they believe they should be, polished, pleasant, peaceful. But behind that smile is a quiet ache, the ache of self-abandonment. Because to keep others comfortable, this part of you learned to leave yourself. You can hear it in their language. It's okay. Don't worry about me. I'm just happy if you're happy. I just want to make things easier for everyone. It's really not a big deal. They've trained themselves to minimize their needs, to feel guilty for having boundaries, to apologize for taking up space, and somewhere along the way they started believing that their worth depends on how useful, likable, and non-threatening they are. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But the one who pleases doesn't get that chance because they're too busy being accepted by everyone else. Their life becomes a performance, not out of manipulation, but out of longing. Longing to be seen, longing to be chosen, longing to be loved, not for what they do, but for who they are. But when you hide your truth to keep love, you start to wonder if the love is real. And here's the quiet tragedy. Even when someone finally does love them, they don't fully believe it, because the person being loved is still a mask, still a filtered version, still a careful edit, so they keep working harder, more helpful, more agreeable, more pleasing, and all the while their true self waits, unloved, unchosen, untouched. This part of you isn't weak. It's incredibly adaptive. It learned how to keep the peace, how to read the room, how to become whatever others needed. But adaptation always has a cost, and eventually the cost becomes too high. You start to lose your voice, your boundaries blur, your resentment grows, and worst of all, you start to believe that love is conditional, that if you ever said what you really feel, people would leave. So what does healing look like for the one who pleases? It begins with discomfort, with letting people down, with saying no, and sitting with the tension, with not fixing every moment that feels awkward, with allowing silence when someone wants a smile. It begins with small acts of defiance against your own habit of vanishing. You say, "I don't agree. That hurt. I actually need space. I'm not okay right now." And the world doesn't end. In fact, something unexpected happens. People get to meet the real you, and some of them stay, not because you pleased them, but because you were true. The fantasy that drives the one who pleases is this: if I can keep everyone happy, I'll finally be safe. But true safety doesn't come from avoiding rejection. It comes from surviving it and realizing that being authentic is worth the risk. You were not born to be decoration. You were not born to be a buffer between others and their discomfort. You were born to be whole, even if it means not being liked all the time, even if it means standing alone, even if it means being called too much. Because the people who truly see you will never ask you to shrink. This shadow doesn't need to be destroyed. It needs to be seen, thanked, released. You can still be kind, but from choice, not fear. You can still care, but not at the cost of yourself. You can be soft and strong, clear and compassionate, true and loved. The one who pleases was trying to protect your heart. But it's time to let your heart speak for itself, not with rehearsed lines, but with truth. because you're not here to be perfect. You are here to be real. They always seem certain, measured, sharp, aware. They notice what others miss, see through the performance, cut through the noise. They have high standards for themselves and especially for others. You'll hear it in how they speak. That's so fake. I don't trust people like that. Everyone's just pretending. No one really understands how things work. They seem insightful, wise, real, but beneath the surface, something else is happening. This is the third face of the shadow, the one who judges. This shadow doesn't scream. It observes, it critiques, it distances, and it's often mistaken for confidence. But it's not confidence, it's protection. Because judgment creates space, and space feels safer than vulnerability. To this part of you, intimacy is risky. Opening your heart is foolish. Trust is dangerous. Optimism is naive. So instead of connecting, you observe, you assess, you label, and with each critique, you pull back just a little further from the world. But here's the truth no one tells you. Judging others often begins with judging yourself. Somewhere inside, this part of you carries a wound. The wound of not being good enough. The wound of feeling foolish, dismissed, too trusting, too open once. And so it learned. Never again. Never again let them in. Never again be the one who gets hurt. Never again feel shame for being sincere. So now this part of you attacks first, not with fists, but with distance. Carl Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But that's hard to accept when irritation is your armor, when critique is your compass, when disapproval is how you stay safe. You look for flaws, because flaws mean you don't have to trust. You point out what's fake, so you don't have to be real. You stay detached, so no one can touch you. But what you call discernment is sometimes just fear. And the cost? Loneliness that doesn't look like loneliness. You still show up, you still speak, you still function. But emotionally, you've left the room. You don't get hurt, but you don't get held either. And deep down, this part of you resents that. It wants connection, but it only knows how to scan for danger. So what does healing look like for the one who judges? It begins when you pause before the next critique and ask yourself, what am I protecting? It begins when you stop mistaking detachment for depth. When you allow people to surprise you. When you soften your categories. When you realize that fake and real are just projections of your own unmet needs. It begins when you admit, I'm afraid to be wrong about people. I'm afraid to look stupid. I'm afraid to care more than they do. And in that honesty, something cracks open. You don't have to stop seeing clearly. Your insight is still a gift, but it becomes wisdom only when it's filtered through compassion. Because the people you judge are usually struggling in ways you don't understand, just like you. This part of you isn't cruel. It's cautious. It learned to be skeptical, so it wouldn't be broken again. But judgment won't save you from pain. It will just keep you outside of joy. And it's okay to come back in. You can still discern, still think critically, still hold standards, but you can do it with an open heart, not a closed one. You can still protect your soul without imprisoning it. The one who judges was just trying to protect what was once humiliated, what was once too trusting, too soft, too expressive. But you've grown since then. You're allowed to try again, to get it wrong, to be surprised, to meet people not as problems, but as mirrors, and to meet yourself not as a critic, but as a soul in progress. They never stay long. In conversations, in relationships, in stillness, they change topics quickly. They joke at the wrong moments. They check their phone when silence enters the room. They disappear just when you start to get close. They always seem like they're going somewhere, but no one really knows where. This is the fourth face of the shadow, the one who runs, not with their legs, but with their attention, their emotions, their presence. Because to them, presence is pressure, stillness is danger, intimacy is too much. They don't necessarily know they're running, they just feel restless. They call it not being ready, or just needing time, or not being built for deep things. But that's not the truth. The truth is, they once felt too much, and no one helped them hold it. So now, when feelings arise, they leave. Sometimes physically, but more often internally. They go somewhere else, into work, into noise, into scrolling, into analysis, into silence, anywhere but here. Carl Jung wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." The one who runs has perfected substitution. They swap feeling for motion, processing for distraction, presence for planning. Because real presence means feeling everything they've been avoiding. And they're not sure they'll survive that. They often seem easygoing, laid back, low maintenance. They don't get attached. They just want peace. They don't like drama. But underneath that simplicity is complexity that's never been allowed to exist. Underneath that peace is chaos that has no words. Underneath the chill is fear. Fear of disappointment, fear of exposure, fear of being seen and not being enough. So instead of being seen, they become invisible, emotionally unavailable, but always smiling, always nice, always just out of reach, not cold, just gone. And the most painful part, they often don't even realize they're doing it, because leaving has become instinct. They don't want to hurt anyone, but people around them feel hurt. They're because they don't know where they stand. One day it's close, the next it's gone. One moment it's open, the next it's quiet. It's not manipulation, it's protection. Because the one who runs believes that if they stay, they'll be asked to feel things they're not ready to feel. Grief, guilt, longing, shame, desires they don't understand, memories they've buried, parts of themselves they can't explain. So they move. And sometimes that movement looks like productivity. They become the busiest person in the room. They fill every hour, every moment, every breath. So there's no space for reflection. But busyness is just avoidance in a suit, and silence eventually finds us. So what does healing look like for the one who runs? It doesn't start with stillness. That's too much too soon. It starts with slowing down, with noticing the impulse to escape and not following it immediately. It starts with letting one moment last a few seconds longer than feels comfortable. It starts with allowing the feeling to rise and not shaming yourself for feeling it. It starts with trusting that staying won't destroy you. They've built an entire world on the idea that leaving is safer, but safety is not the same as freedom. And eventually, the running turns into isolation. You can go everywhere and still feel like you belong nowhere. You can know everyone and still feel deeply unknown, because connection isn't about finding the right person. It's about allowing yourself to be found. This part of you doesn't need to be forced to stay. It needs to feel safe enough to want to, and safety doesn't come from certainty. It comes from compassion. Compassion for the younger version of you that learned to run because no one taught them how to stay. The one who runs isn't weak. They're scared and they're tired. Because disappearing all the time is exhausting, they don't need to be cornered. They need to be invited. Gently, repeatedly, lovingly invited to come home, not to someone else, but to themselves. You don't have to escape your feelings. You don't have to outrun your past. You don't have to vanish just because something feels overwhelming. You are allowed to be here, messy, unsure, feeling too much, and still worthy of love. They're not angry. They're not dramatic. They don't argue or cry or explode. They just shut down. They go quiet. They disappear into themselves. They float above conversations, watching from somewhere far away. They say, "I'm fine. It's whatever. It doesn't matter. I don't feel anything right now." And the world believes them because their voice is calm, their face is still, and nothing seems wrong. But inside, there's a storm they can't name. This is the fifth face of the shadow, the one who empties out. This part doesn't act out. It shuts off. It doesn't scream. It dissociates. It doesn't fight. It goes numb, not because it lacks feeling, but because feeling has become too overwhelming to carry. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." But this shadow isn't directed by an obvious wound. It's guided by the absence of connection to emotion, to aliveness, to meaning. They walk through life like it's underwater, muted, distant, dull. Nothing is really wrong, but nothing feels truly right either. They're not suffering in a way that's easy to see. They're just absent. This absence didn't appear from nowhere. It began as a form of survival. When you're too young to process what hurts, when the world becomes too much too soon, the psyche does something extraordinary. It disconnects, not out of weakness, but out of mercy. It numbs what can't be faced, and that numbness becomes home. So now when life gets too loud, they vanish inward, not to hide, but because staying present feels unsafe. Feeling is a risk. Desire is dangerous. Hope leads to disappointment. So they stay in the gray zone, where nothing hurts and nothing heals. They're the ones who look like they don't care. But in truth, they care so much they've forgotten how to carry it. They weren't given space to process. So now they shrink into silence. And sometimes they don't even know they're doing it. It just feels normal, comfortable even, like a fog that's been there so long they've stopped noticing it. This part of the shadow isn't loud, but it's powerful. It keeps you from fully showing up. It convinces you that aliveness is too much, that presence is too costly, that feeling anything at all will shatter what little stability you've built. But here's the quiet truth. You're not broken. You're not lazy. You're not empty. You're frozen. And freezing is how the soul pauses the story until it's safe enough to continue. So what does healing look like for the one who empties out? It begins with gentleness, not with fireworks, not with a breakthrough, just warmth. It begins with letting yourself feel one thing without judging it, even if it's dull, even if it's just a whisper of sadness, or a flicker of irritation, or a sigh you don't understand. It begins by saying, "I'm here. I don't know what I feel yet, but I'm willing to stay long enough to find out." You don't need to go from numb to awakened overnight. You don't need to fix yourself. You don't need to feel everything right now. You just need to stay. Stay in your body. Stay with your breath. Stay with the part of you that went quiet because the noise was once too much. This part of you is not the end of your story. It's the pause before the next chapter. And sometimes what looks like emptiness is just space waiting to be filled. Not with noise, but with truth. Your truth. Not the version you performed. Not the one that kept you safe. The one you buried beneath silence because you didn't know the world could hold it. You can return now, slowly, softly. No pressure, no timelines. You are allowed to thaw, to re-enter, to feel at your own pace. And when you do, you'll find that life didn't leave you behind. It was waiting for you to come back. You don't need to earn aliveness. You just need to say yes to it. Even if your yes is barely a whisper, even if it trembles, that's enough. That's the beginning. So now you've seen them. 5 faces, 5 defenses, 5 silent shapes the shadow takes when it doesn't know where else to go. Not villains, not enemies, not flaws in your design, but parts of you, adapted, distorted, misunderstood. Parts that once stepped forward when you were too small to protect yourself. Parts that carried pain when no one else could hold it for you. You didn't invent them, you inherited them. From childhood, from trauma, from culture, from silence. And they stayed, not because you're broken, but because they believed they were keeping you alive. Carl Jung didn't say to destroy the shadow. He said to integrate it, to bring it into consciousness, to hold it, see it, study it, with compassion, not contempt. Because the shadow is not the opposite of light. It needs light, just as the unseen needs eyes, just as the unheard needs listening, just as the unloved needs arms that open instead of shut. Integration is not an event. It's not a fix. It's a relationship. Each of these shadow faces, the controller, the pleaser, the judge, the runner, the one who empties out, is a mask placed over a wound. But the mask stayed so long, you forgot there was anything underneath. This is your invitation to remember, not to rush, not to force healing, but to begin a different kind of conversation with yourself. One that sounds less like, "What's wrong with me?" and more like, "What is this part trying to protect? What does it need now? Is it safe enough to soften?" Because here's the truth we're rarely told. The goal is not to be perfect, not to be pure or light-filled or always centered. The goal is to be whole. Wholeness is messy. It's contradictory. It holds opposites. It doesn't always make sense, and that's the beauty of it. You can be both wise and afraid, both caring and angry, both still and restless, both light and shadow. Wholeness is when all the parts of you are allowed a seat at the table, none of them exiled, none of them shamed, just met, honestly, curiously, kindly. And slowly, what once ruled you from the dark begins to step into the light, not to take over, but to be transformed. Some people fear the shadow because they think it's where their worst selves live. But more often, it's where your tenderness lives, your voice, your boundaries, your desire, your fire, your freedom. It's not just what was bad, it's what was forbidden. And bringing it home doesn't destroy your goodness, it completes it. So what now? What do you do with this awareness? You don't go back to pretending. You don't go back to performing. You begin again with more softness, more patience, more truth. You begin to notice when you grip instead of trust, when you smile instead of speak, when you critique instead of feel, when you vanish instead of stay, when you numb instead of name. And you ask, What am I running from? What part of me hasn't been welcomed yet? You begin to witness yourself instead of fixing yourself, and through that witnessing, something begins to shift. Slowly, gently, permanently. There's no map, no step-by-step manual for integration, but there is this: your own willingness to meet what you've been avoiding, your own courage to love what you were taught to reject, your own soul coming back into view, not as a concept, but as a living presence inside you. Carl Jung wrote, "I'd rather be whole than good." And maybe that's the final choice, to step out of the fantasy of goodness and into the reality of wholeness. Because when you're whole, you don't need to prove anything. You don't need to play a role. You don't need to hide your pain or filter your joy. You simply are. And being fully, openly, deeply is the most radical thing you'll ever do. So if you feel tired, not just physically, but spiritually, maybe it's not because you're weak. Maybe it's because you've been split, and the pieces of you are ready to return to each other. Let them, not all at once, but one by one, face by face, shadow by shadow, truth by truth. You are not your patterns. You are not your defenses. You are not your past. You are the one who can witness it all and choose differently. And that's the beginning of real freedom. Welcome home.